Hello and welcome back, and everybody, Levi here. And not too long ago, Wizards held a draft re-release, I suppose it was, for Battle for Baldur's Gate, and with that draft, they released a new dungeon. Now, this dungeon is not legal in any other formats except for that draft, so you might not have heard of this one before because it's technically not legal, but there's so many Rule Zero commanders and Rule Zero decks that people are playing in the format, and if your play group is one of the play groups that is okay with those kind of things, maybe run this by them first. Definitely is a very fun dungeon to build around. So first I'll go over Baldur's Gate Wilderness, and then I'll talk about the deck afterwards. So Baldur's Gate Wilderness, you start at Crash Landing, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put in your hand, then shuffle. I'll go left to right here. Goblin Camp creates a treasure. Emerald Grove creates a 2/2 White Knight. Auntie's Tea House scries 3. You got Defiled Temple, you may sack a permanent if you do draw a card. You got Mountain Pass, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Ebon Lake Grotto creates 2/1/1 flying blue fairy dragon creature tokens. Grim Forge goads up to 1 target creature for each opponent. Githyanki Kraish distributes 3+1/+1 counters among up to 3 target creatures you control. Last Light Inn draws 2 cards. Wraithwind Tollhouse rolls 2d4 and creates that many treasure tokens, so a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 8 treasure tokens. Moonrise Towers, instant sorcery spells you cast this turn cost 3 less to cast. Gauntlet of Shar, each opponent loses 5 life. Balthazar's Lab, return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Circus of the Last Days, create a token that's a copy of one of your commanders, except it's not legendary. Undercity Ruins, create 3 4/1 black skeleton creature tokens with menace. Steelwatch Foundry gives you an emblem that has creatures you control get +2/+2 and have trample. Ansar's Sanctum, reveal the top 4 cards of your library and put them into your hand. Each opponent loses life equal to those cards' total mana value. Or Temple of Baal, creatures your opponents control get -5/-5 until end of turn. So I'd say a pretty typical route that I would go on if I were playing this deck, which I might actually build in person, would be Crash Landing, obviously because you have to, into Auntie's Tea House to scry 3, ramp a land with Mountain Pass. Githyanki Kraish or Grim Forge, doesn't really matter which one you go to, just depends on the board state. Wraithwind Tollhouse to create the treasures. Gauntlet of Shar to have each opponent loses 5 life. Circus of the Last Days to create a token of your commander, and then go Ansar's Sanctum to draw 4 and then have each opponent lose life equal to those cards' total mana value. And the reason I picked those routes specifically is because I feel like they would be the best ones to have a doubled effect. So the commander I picked for this deck is Hama Pashar, Ruin Seeker, 1 white and a blue for a 2/3 human wizard. Room abilities of dungeons you own trigger an additional time. So just imagine you get down to the Circus of the Last Days, create a token that's a copy of one of your commanders, except it's not legendary, and then you actually create 2 of those. So now just getting to that one alone, no additional clone effects or anything like that, you're going to be getting each dungeon trigger 4 times. So by the time you get to the Circus of the Last Days, if you have your commander out, you create 2 copies of it, and then the very next time you venture, you go into the Ansar's Sanctum. Since you have 3 Hama Pashars, it will trigger 4 total times. You'll draw 16 cards and then shoot your opponents for the total mana value of those 16 cards. So that's just one of the crazy things you can do in this deck. So that's actually the reason I said you should probably make sure your playgroup is okay with this, because if that's the pattern you're going to be going through, the game could end rather quickly. It just depends really. But the first category I'm going to be going over here is obviously venturing into the dungeon, because our commander doesn't do that, only gives us a payoff for doing that. So I'll go over some of the better venture cards. Yuan-Ti Malison, 1 and a blue for a 2/1 snake rogue. It can't be blocked as long as it's attacking alone, so that's pretty good. You just swing out with this and it can't be blocked, and whenever it hits somebody, venture into the dungeon, so that's 1 guaranteed every turn. White Plume Adventurer, one of the best ones here, 2 and a white for a 3/3 orc cleric. When it ETBs, you take the initiative. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, untap a creature you control, but if you've completed a dungeon, you untap all creatures you control instead. And I'm not going to go into the entire mechanics of the initiative or the other dungeons, since we're technically not really building around those dungeons, but a little overview of how it works is if you get the initiative, you venture into the dungeon and at the beginning of your upkeep, and then if an opponent hits you, they get the initiative, and then you have to hit them back to get it. So it's kind of like Monarch. So it adds like a little mini game into the overall game that you're playing. One thing to note with initiative, you should actually, if you're playing this in person, this deck, you should be the one to bring 4 copies of the Undercity/initiative token, so people can track their spot in the dungeon as they go, so that like it doesn't get mixed up or whatever. Or you can just have all of them and you can track them for people since it's your mechanic. I don't know. Do with it what you want, but just make sure your opponents are comfortable with it. Tomb of Horrors Adventurer up next, 5 in a blue for a 4/4 elf monk. When Tomb of Horrors Adventurer enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, copy it. If you've completed a dungeon, copy that spell twice instead, choosing targets for the copy. So this is great on ETB. We get to venture, and then whenever you cast our second spell each turn, you copy it. You can get into some crazy shenanigans with this card alone. Radiant Solar up next, 5 and a white for a 3/6 angel, flying lifelink. Whenever Radiant Solar or another non-token creature ETBs under your control, you venture into the dungeon. dungeon, you could pay a white and discard Radiant Solar to venture into the dungeon and gain 3 life. So at a specific point in the game where you don't really have a lot of mana to cast this, but you just need like one more venture trigger to get to that last part to, you know, shoot your opponents for the total mana value of the 16 cards you're drawing or whatever, you could just discard this. I'd say you'd most likely rather cast it because you're going to be getting way more value over the long term of the game. Considering we do have a blinking theme in the deck, which I'll go over after this, you're definitely going to want to have Radiant Solar on the battlefield as soon as you can. Midnight Pathlighter up next, 2 white blue for a 2/3 human wizard. Creatures you control can't be blocked except by legendary creatures, so pretty good if your opponents don't have their commanders out, I suppose. Whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you venture into the dungeon. Very similar to that of Yuan-Ti Malison, but it gives it to all your creatures. Actually wild. And then we got Dungeon Delver for the last one from this category. 1 in the blue for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have room abilities of dungeons you own trigger an additional time. So this with your commander would have your rooms triggering 3 times total. You can see where I'm going with this. The more Hama Pashars that you have out or / Dungeon Delvers, then your rooms are going to be triggering for just insane value. Good luck to your opponents getting you out of that lead. Next category I'm talking about is the Flicker / Blink category. There's been a lot of good Blink / Flicker cards that have come out since that Baldur's Gate Wilderness came out, and certainly since Hama Pashar came out, that really let you blink your cards repeatedly over and over, as opposed to using a lot of the one-shots like Cloud Shift, which I do have in the deck, but it's less instant sorcery based and more permanent based because you can do it multiple times with cards like Abuelo, Ancestral Echo, 1 white blue for a 2/2 spirit flying ward 2. It says pay 1 white blue, exile another target creature or artifact you control, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So this is a repeatable way to blink our creatures. It does cost 3 mana, but when you have those creatures that ETB and venture, or ETB and draw a card, or ETB and do really cool stuff, paying the 3 mana is definitely worth it. Another new one, this one's really new, just came out in Foundations. Kaikar Zephyr Awakener, 2 white blue for a 3/4 bird wizard with flying. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose one. You blink a creature and then return it at the beginning of the next end step, or you create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So 99 times out of 100, we're going to be choosing the blink option as opposed to the spirits, but suppose if you need blockers, that is an option. This one's fantastic because we don't actually have to spend any mana after the initial cost of the creature to be blinking our creatures. We just have to be casting other things besides creatures, and then that blinks our actual creatures. So you could be running through these dungeons really fast if you have Kaikar on the field. I do, however, have some one-shot effects like lae'zel's Acrobatics, 3 and a white for an instant. Exile all non-token creatures you control, then roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, you return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Then the 10 through 20, you do that twice, essentially. You get them back right now, and then you get them back again on your next end step. So this one's definitely worth it. Half the time, you should be able to blink your creatures twice for 4 mana, and if you have, 4 or 5 of those ETB and venture creatures, that's going to be a lot of venture triggers, that's for sure. Another new one since Hama Pashar came out, Metal Door Swift Savior, 3 and a blue for a 3/3 bird soldier with flying. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, exile up to 1 target creature you own, then return it to the battlefield under your control. So this is a combat damage trigger to players and then blinking one of your creatures, so another free way to blink our creatures. OG the Exquisite Blade, 2 white blue for a 2/3 human monk. When OG the Exquisite Blade enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life and scry 2. A little decent ETB on him, but whenever you cast your second spell each turn, exile up to 1 target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So again, with the second spell thing, similar to the Tomb of Horrors Adventurer. However, OG is going to be blinking your creatures, getting you tons of value when you need it. Next category I'm talking about, the card draw. A really fantastic card in any blink deck. Dour Port-mage, 1 and a blue for a 1/3 frog wizard. Whenever 1 or more other creatures you control leave the battlefield without dying, you draw a card. You can also pay 1 and a blue and tap it to bounce a creature you own to your hand. So if you want to pay the 2 to either save something, you could do that, or you can do it to rebuy ETBs. Either way, this is a great card draw. Emoan Mystic Trickster up next, 2 and a blue for a 2/3 human rogue wizard with ward 2. At the beginning of your end step, if you have the initiative, you draw a card, and then you draw another card if you've completed a dungeon. So just good on its own if we have the initiative, and doubly good if we have the initiative and we've already completed a dungeon, which should be pretty easy in this deck, seeing it's how much venture mechanics and blink mechanics we have in the deck. Lastly, Archivist of Gondor, 2 and a blue for a 2/3 human advisor. When your commander deals combat damage to a player, if there is no monarch, you become the monarch. So how likely is that to happen? I don't know. I don't know how good this card is actually going to be in the deck. However, I do really like the last ability. At the beginning of the monarch's end step, that player draws a card. It doesn't totally fit into the theme, but I just thought some more of that passive card draw would be a fun include in this deck, as opposed to just playing a bunch of the typical instant speed blue card draw, which you could do. But I thought throwing in a little monarch, since we're already doing like the venture thing, why not throw in monarch too. Add a little extra layer of fun in there. The last category, utility. These are just cards that don't really fit into some of the other categories that I really think help propel our deck forward. First up, Nano Gene Conversion is an absolutely insane card. 3 and a blue for a sorcery. Choose target creature you control. Each other creature becomes a copy of that creature until end of turn, except it isn't legendary. Couple things to note here. This does count your opponent's creatures. However, it will not matter at all unless somehow they're also playing a dungeon deck, which I seriously doubt unless you have one in your play group. So how this works is you're going to be choosing your commander, and then say you have 4 other creatures on the battlefield. You have your Nano Gene Conversion, cast that, targeting your commander. All of the other 4 creatures you control are going to become copies of your commander. Then that means if you venture into the dungeon once that turn, you're going to be getting the next room ability 6 total times with just those 5 creatures. Obviously, could be more, could be less. You're going to want to obviously save Nano Gene Conversion until you have a big board and a way not on board to venture into the dungeon before you're going to cast this, but just the potential with this card is absolutely nuts. Then I got some clone effects in the deck. Cloning your commander, in this case, especially useful. Vesuvan Duplimancy, 3 and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever you cast a spell that targets only a single artifact or creature you control, create a token that's a copy of that artifact or creature, except it's not legendary. So this works not only with our commander, but if we wanted to use some of those effects like Cloud Shift on one of our non-commander creatures to get extra value, you know, you can just use it how you see fit. Most of the time, you're going to want to use those effects on your commander so that you get extra copies, so that way your rooms trigger just exponentially more times. But this one definitely puts in work. However, it depends if you have enough spells that target your own creatures. So obviously, you're not going to want to do like your removal spells or anything, but maybe you will. Who knows? Find out some cool niche ways to use the Vesuvan Duplimancy in this deck and let me know. Last up here, Archaeomancer, 2 blue, 1/2 human wizard. When it enters the battlefield, you just return a target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So this just rebuys one of your either removal or blink spells. Seeing as how it is an ETB, you can then blink this guy and, you know, keep getting back certain things. There is some pretty cool loops you can get into with Archaeomancer and Kaikar. You know, have the Archaeomancer return something to your hand. Obviously, it's an instant or sorcery, so that triggers the Kaikar's non-creature spell. Obviously, it comes in on the next end step, so it's not like an infinite or anything like that, but it definitely can have some crazy value in this blink deck. But that's it for Hama Pashar and Baldur's Gate Wilderness. I just love the idea of them adding new dungeons, especially ones like Baldur's Gate Wilderness that does actually have that power when it comes to venture, because some of the other dungeons, they're definitely good, but they're not like game-threatening good. Your opponents definitely can't just leave you unanswered to venture through the Baldur's Gate Wilderness as many times as you want, because you're going to eventually kill them with those like life loss abilities that it has. There's also like the board wipe, a bunch of creature tokens. There's tons of different things that you can get from that dungeon. But that's it. I really like the look of this deck. I've wanted to do a dungeon deck for a while. I was thinking of doing it with Varus, the mono green one, for a little bit, but it just seemed a little too boring to me. So this Hama Pashar one I might actually throw together in person. I never had a blink deck. I don't really care for them too much, but when you're doing something janky like this and not just going like full Brago value town, I think it could be really fun. If you want to check out the full deck list, I'm going to have it down in the description. Also in the description is my Patreon. If anybody wants to support the channel, go ahead and give that a click. I have a little intro video over there if you want to watch it. But that's all I've got for today. Everybody, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, take care.